The ocean stretched for miles, silent and endless, broken only by the slow rise and fall of the waves. It was just past dawn when the fishing crew spotted something in the water. At first, they thought it was just debris, a floating piece of wreckage, a lifeless shape drifting aimlessly with the current. But as the boat drew closer, the shadows shifted. It wasn't wreckage. It was a man. He floated on his back, his arms spread wide, his face tilted toward the sky. He was dressed in black robes, the soaked fabric clinging to his body. A silver cross hung from his neck, swaying gently with the motion of the waves. For a long moment, no one moved. The fisherman at the bow whispered, "He's dead." The captain gave a slow nod. The skin was too pale, the lips a shade of blue only the coldest waters could create. His body should have been heavy with death, sinking beneath the surface. And yet, he remained perfectly still, perfectly afloat. Another man leaned over the side, hesitating. "We should bring him in." No one answered. There was something wrong about this. Still, they couldn't just leave him there. The crew tossed a rope over the side, hooking the fabric of his robes, pulling him toward the boat. The water resisted, as if reluctant to let him go. Then, just as the captain reached down to grab his arm, the man's body twitched. A deep, gasping breath tore from his lungs, his chest rising violently as if he had just been dragged from the depths of a nightmare. The crew staggered back. The man was alive. His eyes snapped open, and they were black, not empty, not lifeless, just wrong. The priest sat up. His breaths came in short, ragged bursts, his hands clutching at the deck beneath him as if he were still drowning. Water dripped from his robes, pooling at his feet. The crew bombarded him with questions. "Who are you? How long have you been out there? Where is your boat?" The priest ignored them all. He stared at the sky for a long, unblinking moment. Then, slowly, his head turned toward the captain. His voice was barely a whisper. "It's not over yet." The captain's pulse quickened. "What's not over?" The priest blinked slowly, as if waking up from something distant. When he finally spoke again, the words sent a chill through the deck. "He's still waiting." No one spoke. The ocean stretched silent around them, endless and unknowable. The wind had died. Even the waves seemed hesitant, as if the water itself was listening. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Then, in the distance, the sound of a church bell, faint, hollow, ringing across the open sea. There were no churches here, no land for miles. And yet, the bell tolled once more, and the priest began to smile. The fishing crew didn't speak as they steered back toward shore. The priest sat at the stern of the boat, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His robes were still soaked, but the water didn't seem to bother him. His lips moved in silence, as if whispering a prayer or something else. No one asked him another question. No one wanted to. When they reached the docks, the captain radioed the authorities. They needed to know who this man was, where he had come from, how he had survived. It didn't take long for the answers to arrive, and none of them made sense. The man's name matched a record. Father Elias Moreau, a Catholic priest from a coastal parish hundreds of miles away. But there was a problem. Father Elias was already dead. The crew stared at the officer who had given them the information, waiting for some kind of mistake. But the officer's face was pale, his hands trembling as he held the printed report. The official death certificate had been signed 3 days ago. Drowned. Lost at sea. Buried in the water that should have taken him forever. And yet, he was here, sitting in the police station, waiting. A search into the church's records revealed something even more unsettling. Father Elias had been performing an exorcism when he died, Not in a church, not in a house, on the ocean. The case was highly unusual. A fishing vessel had returned to shore with no crew, just the captain, catatonic, whispering about something below the waves. The church had sent Father Elias. His task, to rid the ship of what had taken them. But something had gone wrong. The last radio transmission from Father Elias was brief, 2 sentences. "I have failed. If I go, it will wait." The signal cut out. When authorities arrived, there was nothing left of the ship, no bodies, no signs of a struggle. Just an empty vessel drifting on the tide. And now, 3 days later, Father Elias had returned. When the authorities asked how he survived, he refused to answer. They asked where he had been, how he had made it back to shore. He just sat there, his fingers clutching his rosary. But in his belongings they found something. A small, leather-bound journal. Most of the pages were illegible, soaked through with seawater, the ink smudged and unreadable, but the final entry remained intact. The last words he wrote before he was lost at sea. "I must finish this. If I fail, it will wait. It will always wait." And beneath those words, a single symbol, drawn in ink, carved into the page with such force that the paper had torn. A circle, surrounded by jagged lines. Not a Christian symbol, something else, something older. The authorities called the church. They needed answers. But when the exorcist arrived to collect the priest, his face went pale. He took one look at Father Elias and whispered, "This is not over." The exorcist arrived in silence. Father Gabriel, a man who had spent decades battling darkness, had seen more than most men could bear. He had cast out spirits in forgotten places, whispered prayers over the possessed, watched souls break under the weight of things they could not understand. But when he stepped into the room and saw Father Elias sitting there, alive when he should not be, he went pale. The younger priests who had come with him exchanged glances. They had never seen their mentor afraid. But now, as he stood in the doorway, his fingers tightening over the small vial of holy water at his belt, they saw something new in his eyes, something they could only describe as dread. Father Elias sat motionless in the chair, his hands resting in his lap, his face hollow and sunken, as if he had spent centuries adrift. He did not speak. He barely blinked. His fingers still clutched his rosary, but the beads were moving, sliding through his grip. One by one, slowly, methodically. Father Gabriel stepped forward, his voice low. "Elias, can you hear me?" Nothing. No recognition, no response. Then, a breath, a slow inhale. And then Father Elias's lips moved. "It's in the water." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the room felt smaller the moment he spoke. The younger priest stepped back instinctively, his pulse hammering. Father Gabriel stayed still. "Tell me what happened," he said. Father Elias's head tilted slightly, as if listening to something they could not hear. "It waits," he murmured. "We failed. And now it waits for someone else." Father Gabriel's jaw tightened. "What did you see?" Father Elias slowly turned his head toward the window. Through the glass, the ocean stretched out into the horizon, dark and endless. The tide had come in since the exorcist arrived. The waves were lapping against the shore, slow and rhythmic. Father Elias exhaled shakily. "I hear it calling." The exorcist turned to the authorities, his expression grim. "You need to release him. Now." The officer frowned. "Release him? He was found floating in the ocean. He has no explanation for where he was, no memory of how he survived. He's still under investigation." Father Gabriel cut him off. "You don't understand," he said. "You think you've pulled him out of the water, but you haven't. He's still in it. It still has him. And if you keep him here, you're inviting something worse." The officer hesitated, his grip tightening on the file in his hands. "What are you saying?" Father Gabriel's voice dropped lower. "It's not just waiting for him," he said. "It's waiting for whoever comes next." The room was silent. The only sound was the distant crash of the waves. That night, Father Elias was placed in a secure hospital ward. They found him kneeling beside his bed, facing the window that overlooked the sea. He had not spoken since his warning, had not moved, but his lips were still moving. The rosary beads slid through his fingers, one by one, an endless motion like a tide that never ended. And just before dawn, he spoke again, not to the priests, not to the guards outside his door, to something else. "Forgive me," he whispered. Then he stood up and walked out. The waves had taken him, but they sent him back. Father Elias had been gone for 3 days, found floating in the open ocean, alive when he shouldn't be. A priest declared dead, a man who had whispered warnings before vanishing into the night. But no one knew why, or what he had been fighting before he disappeared. Until now, the church had kept his mission a secret. It had started with a fishing boat, a vessel that had gone out to sea and returned with no crew. Only the captain remained. He was found curled in the corner of the bridge, rocking back and forth, muttering the same words over and over. "It's still down there. It's waiting." When the authorities boarded the ship, they found the crew's belongings untouched, their food half-eaten, jackets draped over chairs. It was as if they had simply stepped away, then never returned. But in the lower deck, something was wrong. The walls were wet, not with seawater, with something else. A thick, dark stain seeped from the wooden beams, pooling in the cracks of the floor. The ship reeked of decay, like something had been left to rot below deck. But the cargo hold was empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Nothing but the scratches, long, deep gouges in the wooden planks, as if something had been trying to get out, or trying to keep something in. The captain was questioned. He was too far gone to answer. But when he saw the ocean through the hospital window, his mouth twisted into a scream. He backed away, sobbing, pressing himself into the corner of the room. "It knows I'm here." He didn't last the night. By morning, his bed was empty. The security footage showed him walking calmly into the water. The tide took him. His body was never found. The church intervened. They had heard this before. A warning passed down through centuries. There were stories, whispers of something buried beneath the waves, something that was never meant to be disturbed, a presence that called out to those unlucky enough to hear it. And so they sent Father Elias. His task was simple: to cleanse the ship, to break the hold it had on the men who had vanished. But something went wrong. The priest's final words were recorded before the radio signal cut out. A transmission that never should have been heard again. "I have failed. If I go, it will wait. It will always wait." And now, it was waiting for someone else. The captain's fate, the abandoned vessel, and the unseen force beneath the water reinforced the idea that this thing is still out there, and still calling. The security footage showed Father Elias walking out of the hospital at 3:17 a.m. No one stopped him. No alarm sounded. He moved like a man in a trance, barefoot, silent, his robe still damp. The night swallowed him whole as he stepped into the streets. But it wasn't the city he was walking toward. It was the ocean. The nurses had checked on him an hour earlier. He had been kneeling beside his bed, fingers slipping over his rosary beads, one by one. His lips moved constantly, but no sound came out. It wasn't prayer. It was something else. When they found his hospital room empty, the only thing left behind was his journal. A single page had been torn from it, left crumpled on the floor. The last thing he had written. I hear him calling. The police searched for days. No footprints, no sightings, no signs of where he had gone. It was as if the tide had taken him again. And then, a week later, another fishing boat returned to shore. Empty. No crew, no distress call. Just a single set of footprints on the deck, leading to the edge of the boat, stopping there, as if someone had stepped off the side, willingly. And far out on the horizon, barely visible beneath the mist, a figure in black robes floating on his back, waiting. The priest was never meant to return. Now, someone else has taken his place,